Hey, it's Jordan Chariton with Beat the Press podcast. Thanks for joining and thanks for being a patron. This will be free for everybody. And I'm really happy to invite Matt Taibbi, Rolling Stone correspondent, general badass in the media, joining me. How you been, Matt?
Good. How are you doing, Jordan?
Good. Busy. Getting back into the game here. So
Yeah.
there's a lot to talk about. The news is kind of never stops, particularly the Trump media industrial complex. But a lot of other stuff going on too. I wanted to ask you about. I want to start, in the middle of just the constant, Trump and tweets and Russia. You wrote a really interesting book. Full disclosure, I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read some of it. Called "I Can't Breathe,"
Right.
and obviously, after the murder of Eric Garner in Staten Island, and you took a really deep dive into police brutality, the corruption in the police departments, a lot of the financial component. I wanted to ask you, starting out, obviously, it's not getting better under Trump, but
Sure.
my recent experience in St. Louis last year, I was arrested with my cameraman while at the Young Turks. I learned just sitting with like 36, mostly black St. Louis citizens, that they describe it as like modern day Jim Crow in St. Louis. Not just police brutality, but hiring and just the racism hurled at them. Can you kind of give a 360 view of what you learned in your reporting in the book?
Well, I think that was one of the surprising things that I was embarrassed I didn't know more about was the similarity between kind of modern policing tactics and a lot of the legal infrastructure that was built around Jim Crow. The police were given a lot of tools to kind of enforce separatism and segregation after, actually even and before the Civil War, and a lot of that included giving police authority to essentially stop and arrest black people for any reason at all, at any time, giving them tools like vagrancy laws that allowed them to arrest people basically on any pretext. Now we have basically an identical system now in most cities in America where people can be arrested for things like refusal to obey a lawful police order or obstructing pedestrian traffic or loitering, which is essentially identical to what went on all those years. And I think that's what you're going to be hearing about when you talk to people in those neighborhoods is I can't go from one place to another without being stopped by a cop. And that's why I'm upset at the police. I mean, and it's also the basis for a lot of these abuse incidents that go wrong is just the heightened number of incidents that occur between police and population when they have these bogus pretexts for stopping people.
Yeah, and one thing, I find interesting is we know, all over the country that there's this notion in the corporate media that America was just dandy on January 19th. And it's become so much worse since Trump became president. It has in several ways, particularly the environment. But, I look around, I've covered a lot of things in minority communities. You see Flint, East Chicago with the lead problem there, St. Louis. And the common denominator is the economic oppression. Some activists in Black Lives Matter have called it economic terrorism. And that seems to, I'd love your thoughts, but it seems to be perpetuated through the same politicians saying they're for, the working class and minorities. I mean, we just literally now they're deregulating the big banks again. And we know in the 2008 crash, African Americans were disproportionately affected. So what are your thoughts on just this perpetual economic part of this?
Yeah, it's funny. Just to talk about 2008, that's a source of actual serious shame on my part. I covered the financial crisis for almost 8 years consecutively and did countless features on the causes and the roots of the financial crisis. And it really wasn't until sort of the end of my experience on that beat that I started to be clued into the racial angle on that story. And there really was one. It was what happened with subprime mortgages was just a kind of a modern take on what we used to call the contract mortgage, which was a situation where white bankers would go into black neighborhoods and they would offer mortgages on extremely onerous and punitive lending terms, often with no money down. That's essentially what happened with the subprime crisis. We went into a lot of middle and low income neighborhoods, particularly minority neighborhoods, and knocked on doors and offered people refi deals and mortgages, either with no money down or with money that they actually got up front in return for these very, very complicated derivative-based mortgages that turned out to have floating interest rates and ended up causing people to foreclose in their homes almost immediately. So all of that was a massive component of the financial crisis, the racial aspect of it, and even people who were looking hard at it, like me, for years, missed it. And I think that was an area where both candidates, frankly, on the Democratic side in the last election, missed an opportunity to talk about some of the systemic problems with racism. I mean, that was one of Hillary Clinton's tropes was, if we break up the banks tomorrow, it's not going to end racism. And Bernie Sanders could have, if he had wanted to, answered with some of this stuff. And I don't think he didn't do it, probably because he didn't know about it. But in fact, the banks are involved in a lot of extremely racist policies.
Right. And you look at, I mean, the reforms, I put that in air quotes, the police body cams, these kinds of things. I mean, it seems in many cases kind of like smoke and mirrors. I mean, you're seeing even departments that have police body cams, them either not on, not working. We just have another situation, Stephen Clark, a 22-year-old, they say he was carrying a weapon when he was shot at 20 times on Sunday in California. Since the book published, are you seeing improvements in terms of body cameras, this kind of thing? Because it seems to me the police are kind of banding together more than ever to hold court, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't know that those reforms are really going to accomplish a whole lot. The problem with all of these things is it's ultimately political, and one of the things I really dislike about this narrative is that it focuses most of the attention on individual police officers who are often like these working class men and women who come from the suburbs. They don't come from the areas where they're policing, but they're making $40,000-$50,000 a year with a few benefits. But they're not the ones who are ordering, who are coming up with the plan to stop people 500,000 times a year, or to come up with the broken windows theory. They're for the most part they're fulfilling strategies that have been dictated to them from above, and those strategies are coming from in large part, upscale white urban voters who, whether they want to admit it or not, really just don't want black people in their neighborhoods. And that's why you'll see, no matter what reforms you come up with, until you can get rich white urban residents and voters comfortable with the idea of letting people of color into their neighborhoods, you're going to see this kind of aggressive policing, particularly on the borders of rich and poor neighborhoods.
And moving on from aggressive policing to no policing at all, you infamously, I don't know if all the listeners have read this, but one of my favorite pieces from you was The Great American Bubble Machine. It was published 2010. I'll read just a short part. The world's most powerful investment banks is a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. call me dramatic, but it seems like that blood funnel since 2008 has not exactly been severed. And now you have 16 Democrats basically helping Republicans push. I guess it's not a complete repeal of Dodd-Frank, but really peeling back Dodd-Frank, which I don't know what you think, was a Band-Aid. I think it's more of a Band-Aid for a gunshot wound. What are your thoughts now? I guess it's not shocking. It's, Trump's president, but it seems that under the guise of helping small community banks, they are also repealing legislation that would govern the big banks.
It's not surprising. The defections on the Democratic side occurred in about the same ratios that they occurred during the original negotiations of Dodd-Frank, which I covered from beginning to end. When we first sat down to come up with solutions to stop what happened in 2008 from ever happening again, there were just a few simple concepts that people focused on. And had we done that, we would be in much better shape today. The same way that we were after the great crash in the late 20s. The solutions were really obvious and simple. You had to put stocks on open exchanges where everybody could see all the activity. You had to make publicly traded companies adhere to a few basic rules so that people could know what they were investing in. And we had to create a few regulators for a few of the markets, like commodities. And what we have now is we have a situation where we have new financial instruments that have been invented since those laws, like derivatives, like credit default swaps or interest rate swaps, that are not traded on open exchanges. They're traded in the dark. And because of that, the original concepts were really simple. Let's put all this stuff that's now currently in the dark on open, regulated exchanges, and we'll just have the market sort itself out. But what the lobbyists on both sides of the aisle did is they continually larded this bill up with one exception after another until it was this gigantic, unwieldy thing that nobody understood and that barely accomplished anything. And the few things that it did accomplish, like sort of kind of separating depository banks from investment banks, the rules for that were cloaked in pages and pages of verbiage, and now they've just made it even more difficult. They've raised the threshold for what the oversight is going to be from 50 billion to 250 billion in assets. So this was a law that didn't do a whole lot to begin with, and is going to do even less now.
Yeah, and what's kind of troubling to me is I get criticized a lot for covering Democrats critically. If you're not leading the resistance, you're a Kremlin agent, apparently.
Right, yeah.
But obviously, yeah, we'll talk about that. Obviously, Trump is worse than Obama. That's clear. But it seems that the Democrats, under the 24/7 focus on Trump, Stormy Daniels, his tweets, drip, 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 the Cold War reenactment on TV, it seems to me like they're kind of trying to push either a Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris or a Cory Booker, and we might have, either Democrats retake the House or retake the White House in 2020, but these practices that really devastated the economy, the Democrats sound better and more professional and less crazy, but these practices aren't going to change, whether it's the Democrats or Trump. Would you suggest that's true?
Yeah, I hate the line of thinking that you're talking about, the whole they're worse, so why are you focusing on this? That's the same argument that we heard after the Iraq War, when a lot of us who are sort of progressives said, well, wait a minute, we can't start torturing people. That's not who we are, right? And the argument from the conservative side was, well, in Iraq, they're chopping off our heads, they're setting bodies on fire, they're hanging people in public, and you're worried about a little bit of, dunking people in water. What's wrong with you? Those people are so much worse than us. But my point, and I think our point back then, was you have to worry about your own community first, and what the attitudes are there, and that's the most important thing. The people that that you personally have influence over, or with, and that's where it's important to have the argument. If you're always constantly pointing the finger at some group that isn't going to listen to you anyway, then nobody is really examining their own belief systems. And as you say, what's going to happen if we don't start talking now about issues other than Trump is bad, Trump has affairs with Playboy models. We're going to have the same problems at the polls that that people had the last election or go around. But B, also we haven't discussed amongst ourselves what do we really stand for apart from being against Trump. I mean, what could be more obvious than than not approving of Donald Trump as president? I mean, that doesn't take a great intellectual leap, I think it does take a leap to say what policies are going to make the world better. This complicated, screwed up world that we have right now. How do we get out of here, out of this mess? And that's not something that you can fix just by pointing a finger at Donald Trump, I don't think.
Well, also, I mean, forget progressive, neoliberal, what's right morally and ethically. Like, as a political strategy, okay, you ran in 2016 on the focus 24/7 on Trump, the banner of Stronger Together, which really means nothing. And they're kind of doing it again. I mean, months ago, Chuck Schumer came out with like a better deal, and that was what they're for, which was kind of a poll-tested, consultant-written document. Right. But it seems like the same strategy of it lost is being reincarnated for the congressional races and, presumably 2020.
Right. And look, I said this after Trump won. I expected that there would be an immediate reckoning within the Democratic Party about what do we stand for, how do we go forward, because if you were covering the campaign as I did, traveling the country, listening to voters constantly, what you heard over and over again was, I don't trust anybody who's a politician because they're paid for by special interests. And Trump took huge advantage of this by constantly talking about it. He incinerated Jeb Bush by saying, you think Jeb Bush is going to get you cheaper pharmaceutical prices? His campaign chairman is Woody Johnson, who's the head of Johnson & Johnson Corporation. And he was absolutely right about that. This sort of, illicit relationship between big money, big corporate money, and politics is what turns off voters on both sides of the aisle. And the basic critique of the Sanders campaign was, we can't serve two masters at once. We either have to stop taking the money, or we have to admit that we don't really work for ordinary people, right? And they haven't addressed that question yet, because the Democrats, they still want to have it both ways. They want to take all the money from the pharma companies, from Wall Street, from the weapons manufacturers, and they want to call themselves progressives, and it just doesn't work. So I think they just want to put it off for another couple of election cycles, run against Trump, and hope for the best.
Yeah, I mean, I just did a report yesterday. I mean, this stuff happens out in the daylight, just nobody reports on it. But Joe Biden, they had a fundraiser with Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi. This was a discounted one, $17,500 to walk in the door to have, stale prime rib.
Right.
And that's, I mean, during the election, it was more like, $50,000 to $100,000 to, say hello to Hillary Clinton. So, yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because I think, I don't want to speak for you, but for me, the reason I'm so tough on the Democratic Party is, well, this is, at the moment, our main electoral hope to defeating extreme right-wingism. And you can't defeat extreme right-wingism with, all right, they're better for women's rights and they won't ban religions, but they work for the banks. I wanted to move on. You brought up.
Can I just interrupt with one more quick thing about that?
Sure.
There's one other thing about, because they based so much of their campaign strategy in 2016 on raising money, because historically, it's smart. 96 or 97% of the time, the national candidate that raises more money wins. So they focused on that. They were constantly doing fundraisers. The candidate was very often not speaking, but at fundraisers. But the problem with that is that when you're at fundraisers, when you're talking to those people, you're not talking to the other people. You're not getting intelligence about what the vast bulk of voters are thinking and feeling. And that's one of the reasons why the results took them by surprise constantly. I mean, I'm talking about from the beginning of the process to the end. They were surprised first by the Sanders phenomenon. They were surprised by the results in the Republican primaries. Then they were surprised by the final electoral results. And they wouldn't have been had they been out there talking to ordinary people, because it was abundantly clear to anybody who talked to voters on both sides of the aisle that there was unprecedented levels of rage out there. But you're not going to get that if you're talking to people for $17,000 a meal. So I'm sorry, but I think that's a key point.
Perfect segue. Before I get into the Russia stuff, I wanted to ask you, because I often felt kind of like an alien as a reporter on the campaign trail. I'd be at these rallies. I was at many Bernie rallies, Trump rallies, Clinton rallies, and I'd be like one of the few, I guess, national media actually that left the press section.
Right.
Like in the back, they have their stage and the journalists are tweeting and doing their stand-ups, but like I would actually be in the crowd before, after rallies, interviewing voters, and they'd be, some of them would look at me like, "Oh, what's this Young Turk doing?" When I was at the Young Turk, and it was always kind of this alternate reality, like what I was actually hearing from voters, especially in the Midwest and the Rust Belt. I would like turn on TV at my hotel, and it's an alternate reality on CNN and MSNBC, and it seems to have dwarfed now to. I mean, you want to talk about why people were surprised on November 16th, on November 8th, the corporate media was stunned because they never actually spoke with anyone. They were just relying on the pollsters and themselves. What are your thoughts on, the corporate media has also, it seems, not changed one bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've written about this a lot. I've covered now 5 presidential elections, and for several of them, I did them. At first I tried to do it in the way that it's traditionally done, where you fly around with the press corps and you're literally in a flying prison, because once the Secret Service gets involved, you have to get somebody to smuggle you in cigarettes, or I mean, you can't leave the bubble of the plane easily, and you're trapped in the same atmosphere with the aides, the candidate, and other journalists, which is not a good way of, you can crisscross thousands and thousands of miles of territory per day and not see or hear a new thought ever, because you're in the same bubble over and over again. So I immediately saw that this was a problem when I first started doing this, and I would do things like I would get to a city and run a mile in any direction away from the event, and knock on a door and just sit down and talk to people about anything that didn't have to do with politics. And it could be because I realized that the format of campaigning is designed to prevent reporters really from seeing anything that the campaign doesn't want them to see. And increasingly what we do over the years is we rely on the people who are brought into the events, who are often sort of ushered in there by the campaign itself, and we rely on polls for getting our information. And these are 2 highly unreliable indicators of what people out there think. Because if you actually go away from the events, what you find is most people actually hate both parties and aren't planning on voting. Then there's another group that's just furious and has all these things to say, and then there's this relatively small group of people who has a positive feeling about the 2 political parties and goes to these events, and that's what the reporters see most of the time, and that's why they have a skewed vision of what's going on.
Yeah, and to button that up, I think really, let's call it what it is. I mean, these are not news outlets. The majority of them are riding this sugar high of Trump. I mean, I think CNN and MSNBC's profits doubled between 2016, and they usually after an election year there's a drop off in ratings and clicks, and it's only gone up. Right. So obviously, going into the history and the deregulation of telecom would be a whole nother 2 hours, but obviously, like especially CNN, I mean, it's kind of egregious on CNN. I don't think if I've turned on CNN over the last year or two, I other than gun mass shootings, which happen every week now, I've seen very little other than Trump.
Right. Well, Trump makes everybody money. I mean, this is no secret. Les Moonves from CBS with that famous quote, he's not good for America, but he sure is good for business. Everybody knows that Trump gets ratings. We have an industry that has been in continual decline for decades now, but is suddenly, making booming profits for the first time in a long time. And a lot of that has to do with Trump. I look a lot, and those statistics you cited about the ratings, especially after the election, they're so significant. But there's a couple of data points that I find really fascinating. One is that if you look at surveys recently, you'll see that people trust the press less than ever now, but they watch it more than ever. They watch the news more than ever before. So what do those two data points mean? They mean that people are consuming the news as something other than information. They're consuming it as entertainment. So we're making the profits, but where are those profits coming from? We're eating into the entertainment business, which is extremely disturbing, and it should be a source of huge concern within the business, but it's not, because we have this unconscious motivation to make money that is built into the way we look at whether a story is good or not, and that's why we're constantly covering the very stupidest stuff there is to cover.
Which brings us to a story that, I personally think is also part of the ratings motivation. You worked in Russia 20 years ago for a newspaper, The Exile, I believe. I was born during the Cold War in the mid '80s, so I don't remember anything. But in people I've spoken to, it seems that it seems very similar to the lead up to Iraq to me, because that I do remember, how things are just so breathlessly being passed off, anchors kind of regurgitating whatever the unnamed CIA officials tell them, particularly if you're David Ignatius and folks like that. I do think that there's clear evidence that Russia interfered as far as these troll farms and propaganda. I also happen to know that's not a new thing. It's just accelerated. I haven't seen any forensic evidence provided by the government as far as hacking and all that. The declassified presentation they gave last year. I mean, even corporate journalists were saying there's nothing new here. But what are your thoughts just on where we're at in terms of Russiagate, and particularly what is the end game? It just seems like the corporate media is just kind of pounding their chests until everyone basically wants to go towards the brink of war with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, look, this story has been a serious problem in my life, my career. I've lost a lot of friends over it. I'm certainly no friend of Donald Trump. I don't like the guy. I badly wish he wasn't president. But from the very first moment they started pushing this collusion narrative in the news, it just, my spider sense as a reporter just went off and said, there's something about this that doesn't quite feel right. I felt like it was being oversold by a lot of people who were appearing on the news. The parade of should have been disgraced ex-intelligence and military officials who sold us the WMD fiasco, suddenly reappearing on the news every day. That should be a major red flag to reporters. I mean, for Christ, they had Barry McCaffrey on MSNBC last night, and this guy was one of the very worst in terms of getting us into the Iraq War. And in fact, MSNBC, he was on MSNBC pushing us, into that conflict 15 years ago, and they bring him back for this. And if you look
I mean, Bill Kristol might as well be sleeping in the green room. He's on there so much.
It's unbelievable. Bill Kristol, my God, he was like, I would say the Prince of Darkness, except that was Richard Pearl. That was his nickname. Bill Kristol was at the head of that WMD nonsense. He was on the committee to liberate Iraq, and all these groups that have formed up around the Russiagate phenomenon, like the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the German Marshall Fund, they're all part of the Atlantic Council. It's a lot of the same people who got us into the last mess, and that is highly concerning. The fact that we're at an all-time high in terms of tension with Russia. We have a military situation in Syria that's very delicate. We have exercises on the border with NATO, near the Russian border and in the Baltics, NATO exercises. All this stuff is troubling, but the main thing is that I worry about with this story is just to see so many reporters sort of leaping to conclusions, before they have a whole lot of solid evidence to work with. This is a recipe for disaster, and listening to unnamed sources, and assuming that they're not going to hang you out to dry is a mistake that reporters should never make. And we should look back at our history in terms of listening to government sources, particularly unnamed ones. They don't care if they burn us, and that's a thing that I think a lot of the reporters who are sort of neck deep in this now should be concerned about it, because we're way over the edge with this thing. I mean, if any part of it isn't true, it's another major credibility disaster for us.
And I mean, there's many things that concern me about this, but one that you wrote about recently. You wrote a great piece about this blacklist that's been emerging. So basically, it seems like anything that the establishment politicians on either side and the media don't particularly like, say a Bernie Sanders or Black Lives Matter, or what, I've even heard Russian trolls were responsible for how big the Standing Rock demonstrations were. It seems like just breathlessly based on like what some obscure, a new think tank, there's like a think tank between, I think, some of the Democratic stalwarts with Clinton's campaign and these Bill Kristol types that are now researching, quote, Russian influence. It seems like they're ascribing, we've heard Russian trolls were responsible for many Black Lives Matter things, or Standing Rock, or Bernie's. I've even heard from kind of like what I call hillbots on Twitter that Bernie's campaign was so large because Russian trolls propped it up. I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of, it seems like they're trying to drown out dissent by making it seem that dissent isn't real.
Well, I mean, of course, and I get this every day. I get accused of being a Russian spy, probably once every few hours. And look, reporters are human beings. They don't want to be in that place. They do not want to be accused of being in league with any enemy. And so there's a smaller number of people who are expressing skepticism than I know there are in real life, because I know I talk to a lot of reporters who have doubts about this, but there's only a few who've done so publicly, expressed those doubts publicly. And yes, the things like the Hamilton 68 dashboard, which is that think tank you're talking about, they've used this sort of crazy reverse logic, which is that if a Russian bot or a site that is determined to be a Russian bot retweets something involving Black Lives Matter or the Sanders campaign, ipso facto, that means Putin is supporting those movements, and therefore we should reject them. So, we had this article in the Washington Post last November that openly says, what will progressives do when, they use this language, when Vladimir Putin interferes on behalf of Democratic nominee Bernie Sanders in 2020. I mean, they're already setting up as, you know, all these movements, and it seems like the only people who are exempt from this treatment are people who are either, you know, hardcore neocons like David Frum and Bill Kristol, or they're from the sort of corporate wing of the Democratic Party, people like Michael Morrell, who would have been Hillary Clinton's CIA director. And this is deeply troubling, this idea that they've found a way to use the Russia scandal to kind of to as a hammer against other kinds of dissent. I find that extremely suspicious, and it's a byproduct of a story, again, that has yet to really have been proven, but borne out in the news. So I worry about a lot of that.
And one thing that I find not just troubling, but kind of perplexing, I think there's probably, just based on common sense, we both live in the New York area, knowing Donald Trump's history, good investigative reporters could go to town finding information on his business's past dealings in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries. Even without his tax returns, you could probably find some circumstantial or concrete evidence of money laundering, these kinds of things. Yet, I feel like you don't see a lot of those kinds of in-depth reporting or even wall-to-wall coverage, because it seems like the goal is to really focus more on the collusion, which to me, you're trying to stoke the older cable news audience into those Cold War sentiments. What are your thoughts? Because it seems that there should be a lot more investigation and wall-to-wall coverage about the president might be making policy based on his deals or past deals with foreign countries beyond Russia. Could be other countries too. What's your take on that?
Yeah, again, this is a major problem that I have with the story, is that it's so ambitious in its scope. It's not just we suspect that Donald Trump was a money launderer at some point, which or committed fraud. I mean, if you ask me, the story that came out last year about Trump's kids and the Trump Soho project, that story seemed like a really rich avenue of investigation for investigative reporters, and they probably could have found something extremely damaging if they had looked there. I mean, we had evidence that Trump's lawyers were calling up the district attorney there and trying to perhaps intervene in the investigation to prevent a further inquiry. Well, why aren't we looking at that? But the Russia thing, it just too suspiciously dovetails with the sort of larger narrative that, you know, people from the Brookings Institute and the Atlantic Council and groups like that have always wanted, which is an increased level of confrontation with Russia. I mean, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but of all the things that I heard come out of Donald Trump's mouth on the campaign trail, and I sat and listened to that idiot ramble on for almost 2 years, the one thing that he said that actually made a little bit of sense was we should probably try to improve our relations with Russia and tone down the hostilities, because we have nothing to gain from getting into a heated quasi-military conflict with Russia, and yet that seems to be an emphasis of the story. It's not just that we suspect Trump of having committed crimes. It's also we suspect anybody who wants to have better relations with Russia of being somehow suspect. It's an amazing example of this. Just a couple of weeks ago, 4 Democratic senators, Merkley, Sanders, Feinstein, of all people, and Markey, all called for starting negotiations and talks with the Russians. If you look on Google News, you'll find that only one outlet reported on this, The Nation, in 2 weeks. But there's a parade of generals on TV every day who are saying, you know, we're facing a new Pearl Harbor and we have to do more to confront Russia. So there is an infrastructural imperative towards more conflict that makes me nervous about the whole thing as well. And especially with Donald Trump, the last thing you want this guy doing is behaving in a bellicose manner with nuclear weapons towards Vladimir Putin. It's a matter of survival for all of us.
And by the way, these same parade of generals that led us into the Iraq War were on TV 2 days ago on the 15th anniversary, and there was, I think I heard a mention that it was the 15th year anniversary of the Iraq War, but it seems that the military-industrial complex moves on very quickly from, I call it a real war with under fake pretenses. You heard barely a crickets about that anniversary the other day.
Yeah, it was amazing, and the New York Times had the gall to run an opinion piece in their paper saying that the people who got us into that war have been unpunished. I mean, are you kidding? The New York Times played a central role in getting us into that war, and that episode where again, big establishment newspapers and TV stations like the Times and the Post constantly get hoodwinked by intelligence operatives and by government sources who will tell us stuff all the time. They're always whispering in our ear, oh, we know this, we know that. And then when, reporters have to do the job of asking, where did it come from? What exactly is your information? How sure are you? And we don't do that enough, and that's how Iraq happened, because what we basically had was a completely unreliable guy like Chalabi blabbering whatever he thought we wanted to hear, and that turned out to be the basis for a lot of our march to war, and it was because reporters didn't do the work of challenging it.
Right. And my last question on Russia is, I mean, you worked in Russia, you know it way better than I do. I mean, just watching Oliver Stone's Untold History of the United States, I was flabbergasted. I mean, Vladimir Putin, not a good guy. I'm not defending Putin, but I mean, United States, I mean, we pushed up basically on Russia's border as far as NATO. We have missiles, we've had missiles aimed their way on their border in Turkey. We, through, our capitalist spread democracy, basically helped Yeltsin destroy the economy in Russia when it, as it was, the Soviet Union ended. And you had, I forget his name, but you had a former CIA official on Fox News, much less, a few weeks ago, basically was asked well, don't we interfere with other countries? And he kind of was like, well, for good reason. So that seems to be lost in this, the fact that the United States has done some things to antagonize other countries, including Russia.
Well, I mean, I lived there when we meddled in particularly in the 1996 Russian election. And Americans need to know this backstory because they seem to think that we should be invading Russia on the basis of a few Facebook ads when they don't know what we did. What we did was far more significant. In late 1995, Boris Yeltsin was running at about 7 or 8% in the polls. He was going to lose to the communist challenger, a guy named Gennady Zyuganov, who himself was a complete idiot and would probably have been a terrible president. I don't deny that at all. But what happened at that time is that there was a deal brokered between the sort of a Harvard-educated, American-backed deputy who served under Yeltsin, this guy Anatoly Chubais. They went to Davos and met with 7 of the richest Russians, and essentially there was a deal cooked up where the Yeltsin government privatized the jewels of Soviet industry into the hands of literally 7 people in exchange for promises of massive financial support for his re-election campaign. So we single-handedly, and those privatizations were advised upon by the United States. We helped design them. That's part A, that we single-handedly helped create an oligarch class in that country. Part B is that we sent advisors who had offices in the Kremlin and helped Yeltsin design his ads, design his campaign strategy, and we were so proud of it that it was on the cover of Time magazine on July 17th, 1996. If you look, you'll see a headline that says "Yanks to the Rescue." We made a movie about it, starring Jeff Goldblum, called Spinning Boris. Our interference in that election was overt, and it wasn't limited to making a few ads. We fundamentally reordered Russian society and made it more economically unequal in order to pursue the aim of keeping our guy in the Kremlin. And look, Russians didn't call for a war against the United States after that, but that certainly helped lead to the nationalist sentiment that helped put Putin in office. And this is something that Americans just don't understand, is that we're dealing with the Putin problem in large part because he's a reaction to how we behaved in the 90s before he was in office. So all that stuff is relevant.
Right. My last question, nothing to do with Russia or any of that, but you've been in magazine, print. You've obviously digital media as well. You see the changes in the media, and you see now a lot of these outlets that once relied on heavy Facebook traffic. Well, Facebook's changed its algorithm in addition to some other things they've done. Now a lot of people are going paywall. Most of the websites I used to go to, now it's like 5 articles and you're done. You have to pay. I wanted to ask what you think, because whether it's me, I am actually in the process now of working to launch a media network that's going to rely heavily on in-the-field journalism, on a lot of the stories no one else covers, the Flints, the Standing Rocks, the minimum wage battles across the country, kind of the stuff that's not sexy on CNN. I have pitched that idea to some media elites on the East Coast, and they kind of pat you on the back. Oh, that's so admirable, but you can't make money that way. Do you actually think like a kind of, not obviously not a Bernie model, not specific to Bernie, but a small dollar subscription model for in the field independent journalism could work in this country? Or are we kind of doomed to this corporate, you need a big fat cat investor kind of thing?
Well, I think what we call eat your vegetables media has always relied upon being subsidized from somewhere. Traditionally, the trade-off, if you go back to the Communications Act of 27 and then 33, we had a public interest standard, which basically said you can't have a TV or radio license from the FCC unless you make programming that is at least a little bit in the public interest and represents the views of all major groups. So as a result of that, for a long time, at least superficially, we had this idea that, channels like CBS, NBC, ABC, they made their money on sports and entertainment and sitcoms, and then the news was just something we did as a loss leader, and it didn't have to make money. And we started to change our minds about that in the 80s and 90s. When Fox came along, they started to have a new business model that targeted demographics by giving people the news that what they wanted to hear. Platforms like Facebook have significantly accelerated that negative tendency in the media by basically only giving people news that they believe is engineered ahead of time to be in alignment with a person's point of view. So there are whole generations of people who have grown up without ever seeing a piece of news that disagrees with their point of view. And that is extremely dangerous, and we have to find some way to pay for that other kind of media. But also, I think we got to break up, companies like Facebook and Google, because they have a de facto monopoly on media distribution, and they're the source of about 70% of most media distribution in this country. That's too much. That's too much power to have, and given that their way of delivering news to people is so regressive and so negative, we have to come up with a new solution.
Totally agree. You could find Matt's work at Rolling Stone. Obviously, I Can't Breathe, which I will finish reading. I was a little busy the last few months. You could purchase that. Thank you for joining me, Matt. I look forward to doing some more stuff with you in the future.
Thanks, Jordan, and good luck to you.
Thanks. Well, there you have it, folks. Really interesting conversation with Matt Taibbi, who, a lot of the things he said, you don't particularly hear in the corporate media. So it's really helpful to hear the history on something like what America did to interfere with Russia's election in 1996, and all those things. So I think that I'm glad I could bring him to you. I'm going to be bringing others like him to you over the next few months. Independent journalists, journalists that might work for a more corporate outlet, but actually write valuable things and report valuable things. And obviously, I will be talking to activists who you also won't see in the corporate media, so we could find out on news that's going on around the country that we don't know about. I have always admired Matt Taibbi. He has written a foreword for Hunter Thompson's book, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 72. I think he adds a lot of expertise, and his writing is really, really raw and humorous and cutting, and I appreciate him joining. If you don't know, I am now launched on Patreon. I have a reporting page. It's patreon.com/Jordan Chariton Reports. We made this podcast free so you could get a taste of what I'm going to be doing. You could go to patreon.com/Jordan Chariton Reports, where you'll get my podcasts, you'll get my daily video diaries, which is going to give you a little behind the scenes, what the stages are, what the steps are that we're at in launching this new media company. Hopefully by the summer. We are in the beginning stages of that, sending out the business proposal. We have a name, we have a logo. I think it's badass, and we will reveal that in due time. So I appreciate for those. We already have over 100 patrons signed up, and we've only had it up for a week. So definitely check it out, patreon.com/Jordan Chariton Reports. We need to be the media we want to see. So we need to create the media we want to see. And let's keep it real. That's going to involve your financial support. That's going to involve your social media support. A lot of these social media outlets are now suppressing independent journalists, and you don't see our work as more visibly in your feeds. So, whatever you could do, $2 subscriptions a month, $5 subscriptions a month, $10 subscriptions a month. It will help me get back in the field where I like to be. It will also help me to create the network that I believe we need, which is going to feature other reporters covering the Standing Rocks, the Flints, the East Chicagos, the water contamination around the country, the police brutality, the corruption going on as far as state and local politicians that you never hear about but are just as corrupt on the federal level. I want to bring that all to you. Help me get there. One more time, patreon.com/Jordan Chariton Reports. And also visit my website, jordanchariton.com. Sign up for my email list. Part of building a new company is cutting out YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and having your data directly. I will not do what Facebook did and then have it allow it to be sold off to third-party companies. We just want your email so we could update you and communicate directly with you. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks to Matt. And also subscribe, youtube.com/Jordan Chariton Reports. Peace.